There are people who live beside us, who smile at us in grocery store aisles, who coach our children's sports teams, who install security systems in our homes to protect us from the very terror they themselves embody, and we never know. We can never truly know what lives behind the eyes of someone who has learned to wear normalcy like a second skin. And this is the story of such a man, a husband, a father, a churchgoer, a civic volunteer, someone who existed in plain sight while carrying a darkness so profound that it would eventually consume 10 lives across nearly 2 decades and shatter the illusion of safety in an entire American city. Here on Crime and Prejudice, we explore not just the what of true crime, but the why, the psychological architecture of human darkness. So if you're drawn to stories told with empathy, depth, and a commitment to understanding rather than sensationalizing, please consider subscribing because these stories matter, these victims matter. In 1945, in the modest town of Pittsburgh, Kansas, a boy was born into an ordinary family, the eldest of 4 sons. And there was nothing in those early years to suggest what would come, nothing that screamed danger or predicted the monster he would become, though later psychologists would pore over his childhood looking for clues, for the moment when something broke or twisted inside him. And they would find some disturbing signs: the killing of animals, the early fascination with bondage and control, the sexual fantasies that began to form in adolescence, fantasies that never involved mutual pleasure or connection but only domination, suffering, and absolute power over another human being. Dennis Rader grew up in an era when such darkness often went unspoken, when boys were told to be tough, when psychological disturbance was stigmatized rather than treated, when the vocabulary for understanding sexual sadism barely existed in mainstream American consciousness. And so he learned early to hide, to compartmentalize, to build a wall between the outer self that functioned in society and the inner self that hungered for something unspeakable. He joined the United States Air Force in the 1960s, served his country, learned discipline and structure, perhaps even found a way to channel some of his compulsions into the rigid hierarchy of military life. And after his service ended, he returned to Kansas, to Wichita, where he would spend the rest of his life. And in 1971, he married a woman named Paula Dietz, and they would have 2 children together, a son and a daughter. And to everyone who knew them, they seemed normal, perhaps even enviable in their suburban orderliness. He worked various jobs, he attended church regularly, he became a scout leader, he was active in his community, he installed home security systems for ADT. And there is a terrible irony in this, that people invited him into their homes, trusted him to make them safe, paid him to protect them from intruders and criminals, never knowing that the greatest threat was standing right there in their living rooms, measuring their windows, examining their locks, learning the layout of their homes. By 1974, Dennis Rader was 28 years old, married for 3 years, and something inside him that had been building pressure for his entire life was about to explode into the world in the most horrific way imaginable. On January 15th of that year, on a cold winter morning in Wichita, he chose a house. He had been watching the family. He knew their routines. He knew the father would be at work. And he entered the home of the Otero family. And what happened in that house over the next hours is almost too terrible to fully articulate. But the facts must be stated because these were real people whose lives were stolen, whose final moments were filled with confusion and terror beyond comprehension. Joseph Otero, the father, had already left for work. But inside the home were Julie Otero, the mother, and 4 of their children, and Rader used a ruse to gain entry, perhaps claiming there was a problem with the phone lines or that his car had broken down. Something innocent that wouldn't alarm a mother trying to get her children ready for school. And once inside, he revealed his true intentions. He had brought rope and tape and a gun. And he forced the family into different rooms. He told them he was on the run, that he just needed money and a car, and he would leave. He lied to them to keep them calm while he prepared for what he had really come to do. He strangled Joseph Otero Jr., the 11-year-old son. He strangled Julie. He strangled 9-year-old Josephine. And he hanged 11-year-old Josie from a pipe in the basement. And in those final moments, each of them must have been gripped by a terror so absolute that the mind recoils from imagining it. The realization that this stranger had not come for money or escape, but for them, for their lives, for their suffering. And 3 other Otero children who were not home that morning came back to find their family destroyed. their lives forever fractured by unthinkable loss. And Wichita police arrived at a crime scene that suggested a level of cruelty and planning that was deeply disturbing. This was not a robbery gone wrong or a crime of passion. This was something calculated, something ritualized, something that bore the signature of a particular kind of monster. The police had no leads, no suspects, nothing to go on except the evidence of methodical brutality. And Dennis Rader went back to his normal life. He went home to his wife and young son. He went to work. He functioned as though nothing had happened. And this is one of the most chilling aspects of his psychology. The ability to commit unspeakable acts and then slide seamlessly back into the role of husband and father and community member without visible distress or guilt. But he wanted recognition. He wanted people to know what he had done. He wanted the fear and the attention and the knowledge that he had power over an entire city. And so in October of 1974, 9 months after the Otero murders, he placed a letter in a book in the Wichita Public Library. And someone eventually found it and turned it to authorities. And the letter described the Otero murders in detail that only the killer could know. And it was signed with a name he had given himself, BTK, which stood for Bind, Torture, Kill, his method, his signature, his brand. This was the beginning of a cat-and-mouse game that would stretch across decades. A game in which Rader would periodically contact police and media, taunting them, describing his crimes, sending puzzles and poems and drawings, feeding his own narcissism and his deep need to be acknowledged as someone special, someone powerful, someone who had achieved what others only fantasized about. And the city of Wichita lived in fear because the police could not seem to catch him, because he struck without warning, because he seemed to vanish completely between attacks. And no one suspected the quiet man who installed their alarm systems or led their children's scout troops. In April of 1974, just 3 months after the Otero murders, he broke into the home of a young woman named Catherine Bright. He was prepared to kill her alone, but her brother Kevin came home unexpectedly and fought back. And in the struggle, Rader shot Kevin twice, but Kevin survived. And Catherine was stabbed multiple times and died from her injuries. And this was another data point for investigators, but still they had no real leads. No way to identify the killer who moved through Wichita like a ghost. He waited 3 years before killing again. And during those 3 years, he was building his normal life. His wife Paula gave birth to their daughter in 1978. He was working steadily, attending church. And whatever engine drove his compulsion must have been temporarily satisfied by the first 2 attacks, or perhaps he was being cautious, waiting for the investigation to cool, learning from any mistakes he thought he had made, refining his technique. In March of 1977, he killed Shirley Vian, a mother of 3 young children, and the children were in the home when he arrived. And he locked them in the bathroom before strangling their mother. And the psychological terror of those children, hearing something happening in the other room, but not understanding what, trapped and helpless, is almost unbearable to contemplate. And once again, Rader sent communications to the media. Once again, he wanted credit, wanted recognition, wanted the city to know that BTK was still out there, still watching, still capable of striking at any moment. In December of 1977, he killed Nancy Fox, a 25-year-old woman who lived alone. And after killing her, he called the police from a payphone and told them where to find her body, his voice calm and matter-of-fact, as though he were reporting a broken streetlight rather than a human life he had just extinguished. And the recordings of that call are chilling in their casual tone, in the complete absence of remorse or emotion. Just a man providing information and then hanging up and walking away into the night. He sent more letters, more poems, more packages to media outlets. He was playing a game with law enforcement and with the public, and he was good at it. He was disciplined and careful and smart enough to avoid the mistakes that caught most serial killers. And as the 1970s ended and the 1980s began, the people of Wichita learned to live with a constant low-level dread, wondering when BTK would strike again, wondering if their doors were locked securely enough, if their alarm systems would protect them, never knowing that the man who installed those very alarms might be the one they needed protection from. In 1985, he killed his neighbor, Maureen Hedge, in April of that year. And he took her to his church where he worked as a compliance officer and photographed her body in various bondage positions. And this detail reveals the depth of his depravity and his narcissism, that he would use a sacred space, a place of worship and community, as a stage for his perverse documentation, that he felt so invincible that he believed he could do this without consequence. In September 1986, he killed Vicky Weggerl, a 28-year-old mother, and once again he used a ruse to gain entry, pretending to be a telephone repairman, exploiting the trust that people naturally extend to service workers and authority figures. And he strangled her and left her for her husband to find. And Bill Weggerl lived under a cloud of suspicion for years because police initially suspected him. Because when there is a murder in a home, the spouse is always the first suspect. And this is another layer of cruelty that Rader inflicted. The destruction he caused rippled outward far beyond his immediate victims, touching families and communities and investigators who carried the weight of these unsolved cases for decades. His final known murder was in January 1991, when he killed Dolores Davis, a 62-year-old woman. And after this killing, he went silent. Completely silent. No more letters or calls or packages. No more communications of any kind. And investigators and the public wondered if he had died or moved away or been incarcerated for some other crime. Or if perhaps he had simply stopped, satisfied whatever dark hunger had driven him. Though anyone who understood the psychology of serial killers knew that they rarely just stop, that the compulsion doesn't simply switch off, that something else must have changed in his circumstances or his calculation of risk. The truth was simpler and more mundane. He was getting older. His children were growing up and becoming more aware. His job responsibilities were increasing, and perhaps most importantly, the rise of DNA technology and improved forensic techniques meant that the risks of getting caught were increasing exponentially with each year that passed. And Rader was nothing if not calculated in his approach to risk. He had always been careful, always methodical, and he could sense that the game was changing, that the advantages he had enjoyed in the 1970s and 1980s were eroding in the age of genetic databases and digital surveillance. For 13 years, BTK vanished from public consciousness. The case went cold. Newer tragedies and newer fears replaced the old ones. And many people in Wichita dared to hope that maybe it was over, maybe he was dead, maybe they could finally live without that shadow hanging over their city. And Dennis Rader continued his normal life. He served as a compliance officer for Park City. He measured people's grass and issued citations for code violations. He was known as rigid and somewhat officious, but nothing more than an annoying bureaucrat. Certainly not a serial killer, certainly not one of the most prolific murderers in Kansas history. In 2004, on the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders, the Wichita Eagle ran an article about the case, speculating about what had happened to BTK, wondering if he would ever be caught. And this article apparently triggered something in Rader. His ego could not tolerate being forgotten, could not accept that the city had moved on without acknowledging him. And he began sending communications again, letters and packages, and eventually a floppy disk. And this would prove to be his fatal mistake, the error in judgment that would end his 3-decade run and bring him finally to justice. He sent the disk to a local television station in February 2005, and included with it was a note asking if the disk could be traced. And the police, in a brilliant piece of psychological manipulation, said no, told the media to report that the disk was safe, that he could use it without worry, knowing that his narcissism and his desire for continued communication would override any lingering caution. And Rader believed them. He had gotten away with it for so long that he perhaps felt invincible, felt that the rules that applied to other criminals did not apply to him, and he sent the disk. Forensic analysts examined the disk and found deleted metadata that led them to Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita and to a user named Dennis. And with this lead, police were able to identify Dennis Rader, to conduct surveillance, to obtain DNA from his daughter's medical records at the university she attended, and to confirm through genetic testing that he was almost certainly BTK. And on February 25, 2005, they arrested him. And the entire city was stunned. His neighbors were stunned. His family was stunned. His co-workers were stunned, because how could this boring, annoying, ordinary man be the monster who had terrorized Wichita for decades? How could someone hide something so enormous behind such a mundane exterior? His wife Paula filed for divorce immediately. His children had to grapple with the unbearable knowledge that their father, the man who had raised them and tucked them in at night and coached their teams, was also a serial killer who had murdered 10 people, including children, and this cognitive dissonance. This collision between the father they knew and the monster he actually was created a trauma that would take years, if not a lifetime, to process. In June 2005, Dennis Rader pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. And during his confession in court, he described each killing in meticulous detail, showing no emotion, no remorse. Speaking about the murders the way someone might describe a home improvement project or a recipe they had perfected. And the families of the victims sat in that courtroom and listened to him describe the final moments of their loved ones with clinical detachment. And the cruelty of that, the absolute lack of recognition of their humanity, was in some ways a final act of violence against them. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms, a minimum of 175 years in prison, because Kansas had no death penalty at the time of his sentencing. And he is currently incarcerated at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he will die, where he will never again walk free, never again have the power to hurt anyone. And this is some small measure of justice, though it can never restore what was taken, can never undo the suffering he caused, can never give those 10 victims their lives back or give their families peace. His daughter, Carrie Rawson, has spoken publicly about her experience, about the process of reconciling the father she loved with the monster he truly was. And in 2025, a documentary was released that focuses on her perspective, on the victims' families, on the long shadow that BTK cast over an entire community. And these stories of survival and healing are important because they remind us that true crime is not entertainment. It is not a puzzle to be solved for our amusement. It is real people whose lives were destroyed, real families who still carry that loss every single day. The psychology of someone like Dennis Rader is complex and disturbing. He exhibited classic traits of psychopathy: the lack of empathy, the superficial charm, the ability to compartmentalize, the grandiose sense of self-importance, the need for control and power. And he also exhibited traits specific to sexual sadism: the arousal he derived from the suffering of others, the ritualistic nature of his crimes, the documentation and reliving of his acts through photographs and writings. And psychiatrists who have studied his case note that he likely began developing these paraphilias in early adolescence, and that by the time he committed his first murders, he had been fantasizing about such acts for well over a decade. His mental rehearsals had been so thorough that the actual commission of the crimes probably felt almost anticlimactic, almost mechanical, and this is why he needed the letters and the media attention and the game with police. Because the kills themselves, while satisfying his immediate compulsion, left him empty afterward, craving the recognition and validation that would confirm his specialness, his superiority, his power. There are those who argue that such people are born broken, that there is something in their neurology or brain chemistry that makes them fundamentally different from the rest of us, incapable of genuine human connection or moral reasoning. And there is some scientific evidence to support this. Studies showing differences in the brain structure of psychopaths, particularly in areas associated with empathy and emotional regulation. But there are also those who argue that environment plays a crucial role, that the seeds of such violence are planted in childhood through abuse or neglect or exposure to violence. And that while perhaps not everyone who experiences such trauma becomes violent, those who have a particular neurological vulnerability might be pushed toward that path by environmental factors. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. A complex interaction between biology and environment, between innate temperament and lived experience, between the brain you are born with and the world that shapes it. And this is cold comfort to the families of victims who want simple answers, who want to understand how someone could do what Dennis Rader did to their loved ones. But the reality is that human psychology is messy and complicated and not always amenable to simple explanations. What we can say with certainty is that Dennis Rader made choices. He chose to nurture his violent fantasies rather than seek help. He chose to act on his compulsions rather than resist them. He chose to lie and manipulate and hide for decades rather than confess. And while we can acknowledge that his psychology may have made these choices feel inevitable to him, we can also hold him responsible for them. We can recognize that regardless of what drove him, the harm he caused was real and the accountability must be real as well. The case also raises uncomfortable questions about how we live together in society, about the limits of what we can know about the people around us, about the masks that people wear and the secrets they keep, and about the systems we have in place to protect the vulnerable from predators, and whether those systems are adequate, whether we have learned enough from cases like this to prevent the next one, or whether there will always be people like Dennis Rader who slip through the cracks, who learn to appear normal while harboring darkness, who exploit the trust and openness that makes community possible. In the years since his arrest, investigators have wondered if there might be other victims, other unsolved cases that could be connected to him. And while Rader has confessed only to the 10 known murders, there are gaps in the timeline, periods where he was not communicating or known to be killing. And it is possible, though not proven, that there were others whose deaths he never claimed, whose families never received answers. And this uncertainty is another form of torture for those who have missing loved ones. The wondering if perhaps this monster was responsible for their loss as well. This story is based on real events and is shared for educational and informational purposes. It is not intended for viewers under 18 and does not glorify violence in any form. Please watch responsibly. The case of Dennis Rader forces us to confront the disturbing reality that evil is not always obvious, that it does not always announce itself with clear signs and red flags, that sometimes the most dangerous people are those who have learned to blend in perfectly, who have mastered the performance of normalcy, who use our trust and our social conventions as weapons against us. And this is terrifying because it means there is no simple way to protect ourselves, no checklist we can run through to identify the threats around us. We are left with uncertainty and vigilance, and the hope that our institutions and our communities are strong enough and wise enough to catch these predators before they destroy too many lives. And sometimes, as in this case, we fail. We fail for decades, and people die because we failed. And all we can do is try to learn, try to do better, try to honor the victims by refusing to look away from the uncomfortable truths their deaths reveal about the society we have built and the shadows that still lurk within it. And in the end, we are left with the knowledge that monsters are real, that they live among us, that they are not strangers in dark alleys, but neighbors and co-workers, and sometimes even the people we trust most. And this knowledge should not paralyze us with fear, but should instead make us more aware, more compassionate, more committed to building communities where people feel safe enough to ask for help, where signs of disturbance are met with intervention rather than stigma, where we protect the vulnerable not through fear and isolation, but through connection and care. Because that is the only real defense we have against the darkness. Not walls and locks and security systems, but our shared humanity, our willingness to see each other clearly and to act when we see someone suffering or someone causing suffering. And if this story teaches us anything, it should teach us that indifference is dangerous, that looking away is dangerous, that assuming everything is fine because it appears fine is dangerous, and that we owe it to the victims, to their families, to ourselves, to stay awake, to stay aware, to never forget that beneath the surface of ordinary life, darkness can grow and fester and wait for its moment. And our job, our responsibility, is to shine light into those corners, to refuse to let evil hide behind masks of normalcy, to say their names. Julie and Joseph and Josephine and Josie Otero, Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicky Wegerle, Dolores Davis. To remember them not as statistics or case files, but as people who lived and loved and deserved so much more than they got, who deserved to grow old and see their children grow and experience all the ordinary joys that were stolen from them by a man who valued his own gratification over their lives, over their humanity, over everything that makes life worth living. And in remembering them, we honor them. And in honoring them, we commit ourselves to the hard work of making sure that their deaths mean something, that we learn from this tragedy, that we do better, that we build a world where people like Dennis Rader are identified and stopped before they can destroy so many lives. And that is the best memorial we can offer, not monuments or plaques, but a genuine commitment to vigilance and compassion and justice, to seeing each other, to protecting each other, to refusing to look away when something feels wrong, because sometimes that feeling, that instinct, that small voice that says something is not right here, is the only thing standing between a potential victim and a monster. And we owe it to ourselves and to each other to listen to that voice, to take it seriously, to act on it, Because in the end, we are all we have. We are all that stands between order and chaos, between safety and predation, between the world as it should be and the world as Dennis Rader tried to make it. A world where power and control and suffering are pursued without conscience or consequence. And we said no. Collectively, we said no. It took too long and cost too much, but eventually we said no. We caught him, we stopped him, we locked him away forever. And while that cannot undo the harm, while it cannot bring back the dead or heal the broken, it is something. It is a line drawn in the sand that says this far and no further. This we will not tolerate. This we will not accept. And that line matters. That refusal matters. Because it is what separates us from him. What makes us human rather than monstrous. What gives us the right to say that we are better than our worst impulses, better than our darkest fantasies, better than the easy cruelty that tempts us all in moments of anger or frustration or fear. We are better because we choose to be better every day, in every moment, in every decision we make about how to treat each other, about what to value, about what kind of world we want to build. And the story of Dennis Rader is ultimately not a story about him at all. It is a story about us, about the communities that failed to see him for what he was, about the systems that failed to catch him sooner, about the victims who deserved better protection, about the families who deserved better justice, and about what we owe each other in the face of such darkness, which is everything. Our attention and our compassion and our commitment to never let something like this happen again, knowing full well that it will, that there will be others, that the darkness is always there waiting for its moment, but refusing to accept that as inevitable, refusing to become numb or cynical or resigned, holding on to hope and determination and the belief that each life matters, that each victim deserves to be remembered and honored and mourned, and that the work of building a safer and more just world is never finished, never complete, always demanding more from us. More awareness, more courage, more willingness to speak up and intervene and refuse to look away. And that is the only real answer to evil, not revenge or hatred or fear, but the stubborn insistence that we will do better. We will be better. We will honor the dead by protecting the living. We will remember what was lost by fighting for what remains, and we will never, ever forget that behind every crime statistic is a real person who laughed and cried and dreamed and deserved to keep living. And that truth, that basic recognition of shared humanity, is what separates us from monsters like Dennis Rader. And it is what we must hold on to, always, no matter how dark the story gets, no matter how much easier it would be to look away.